Okay, so let's take a look at something here that I wanted to discuss about principles.
Is that your phrasing?
No, this is from the Art of Thinking lecture, and I think it's one of the latter lectures. I can't remember exactly
Yeah.
which one it is. Yeah, so all understanding is observing data and taking it back a step at a time until ultimately reducing it back to the metaphysical primaries. That was so that I assume he means this A is A, ultimate A is A, or like laws of logic or philosophical axioms. That I assume that's what he means by metaphysical primaries.
It sounds like it. Or the more fundamental ones, like, well, I think he just means philosophical primaries. That's what it looks like.
And so, what about that is understanding? Like, if I observe, maybe I need to go beyond the perceptual level, but I'm thinking right now on the
Right.
perceptual level. Like, if I observe a water bottle and I go, oh, existence exists, like what? I'm just not clear on, yeah, what that means.
So
You have any?
all understanding. Well, I think he's starting here saying that all understanding begins with perception when it's observing data. In that
Yes.
sense, like that, anything, any fact we know will always be ultimately related to or based on something we've seen or perceived. And taking a step back sounds like it could be just finding the underlying principle or the underlying concept or abstraction.
But okay.
So it sounds like he's saying taking it back as in going more abstract. And I don't think he means reduction as in validation. I think he means taking it back as in wider and more abstract,
Right.
more basic, more capturing more concretes in the world.
So the goal is to find the widest abstractions possible, and that's what philosophy does. And then
Or
it's like
Peikoff
philosophy's,
likes
yeah.
Peikoff likes to phrase the question that came from the Greeks, finding the one in the many. That's how he likes to phrase it. He always brings that up. We're talking about philosophy, history of philosophy, the one in the many. So it's that uniting abstraction, whatever unites them in the ultimate. One in the many is existence. Like that's the one where everything is unified into.
Okay. So philosophy is the one in the sense that it unifies all knowledge. Let's say it
Yes.
gives you the widest abstraction. Existence
Yes.
exists. Uh,
Yes.
only existence exists, or what existence exists, the law of identity and cause and effect and whatever else. And
Yeah.
so it gives you the widest abstractions. And then from there, your task is to investigate the universe and find new laws and integrate them into those wider abstractions. And so you keep finding more and more generalizations or laws, or as he says, I think he says laws of physics. I don't know why he said
Yeah.
laws of physics as ultimate laws of physics as a starting point, but
Not sure.
yeah, but the point is, so you investigate the universe, you create these theories, hypotheses, abstractions, generalizations, principles from psychology, from physics, from biology, and you keep relating them further back. You relate them to the widest abstractions in philosophy, so you tie them back in, and it's like a string of abstractions. Or like what do you know what are that what are those little children toys where they're these rings that are piled on each other and they get sequentially smaller?
Can't think of what that is.
It's sort of like that, right? Like it's actually that's a spiral almost, right? So it's like so
Yeah,
you
that's because I mean that's the spiral theory of knowledge,
right.
going back and forth and building on it. Like you reduce it back, but then you also advance what you started. You could advance your understanding in science, but you also go back to further ground your understanding of the basic primaries, the basic facts of
Right.
existence, the metaphysics.
Okay. All right. I get it. And to tie something back is to relate one thing to another. So that's why you have
Yeah,
greater
in this
knowledge.
context, that's what it sounds like he's talking about. He's not talking about validation in this context, which that's a different sense of reduction, I think, where you try to validate and reduce it to the perceptual level. That's something else.
Right. So here it seems like, yeah, it's taking everything, or I don't want to say reducing, but it's looking at everything you know from the perspective of here, knowing where its starting points are, as in like what is not reducible about it anymore. Like, okay, you've got all these laws, you've got these generalizations, but can you take all that knowledge and bring it down to some item of knowledge where you say, I can't get behind this. Like I can't, there's just something there that exists, and that's where we begin. Like there's a starting point. So that's what he's saying, right? Yeah, you have to get it back,
Right.
or relate everything to starting points.
Yeah, we're not trying to demonstrate that let's prove reality exists. Well, no,
Right.
it's just a starting point. Like
Yes.
there's reality, so what do we do about it? It's
Okay.
there, so now what? Rather
Yeah.
than prove that it's real first. Like that's backwards.
Yeah.
Which is what Descartes probably tried to do. He tried to prove that he can even trust that reality is there, which
Right.
is all backwards.
Right. Okay. Actually, semi-related. Why? Let me see if I can find something that I was going to paste in here, and I'll give you context for it. Where is it? Oh, I can't. Oh, maybe it's here. Oh, here it is. Okay. Can put that. How come, like it's that in a sense you can say, oh, that's when you're looking at another philosopher, you can say, oh, that's silly. That doesn't make any sense. And like, why would anyone think that? Or like, that's stupid. How could someone fall into that? But it can't be, because they have so much weight and influence. Like they'll say, this is a thing, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I've heard phrases like that.
like, and an average person will read this and go, what is this? Like, this is a load of shit. But then, and yet it can't, at the same time, it's, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it's like, it still seems to, how do these things have so much weight? Like, how do they, I don't get how, like, even, I saw a quote from Heidegger. Nassim Taleb quoted him to laugh at him, which it seemed ridiculous, and yet it just has so much, how do these things have this power?
I mean, I would only describe it in a how to deal with your life kind of sense. Like it stems, at least these kind of philosophers, I'm sure, Sartre, I'm sure, stems from like the time period, like how to deal with the world where there's dictators all around. And to me, it seems more like that. I'm not positive really, but
Yeah. Okay.
it seems to be a lot to do with that like the absurdity is almost what makes most sense to them.
Okay.
The fact that it's insane probably is what's appealing, because the world is so apparently crazy to them that it's like, this is the only meaning we can find, is what we assert it to be, which kind of is what existentialism is. A lot of like declaring what you want things to be in the face of the absurd.
Right. Okay.
I think it's usually cultural related or responding to the times. Like that's why it stems at that unique period of time. It might be reacting to science or politics or something.
Got it. And then it's hard when I read it to go, I don't know how this is. I don't even know what they're saying half the time. So
yeah, like we could think of Rand as partially responding to her world, that the rise of communism and maybe the decline of meaning and like maybe the simplification of life and in the sense everything becomes machine-like sometimes, in trying to find an alternative outlook. Or we could think even like Kant is maybe a response to like the type of world he was in, where there's a growing understanding of everything. They can start to explain everything. So it seems like he probably needs to like, oh, it's time to reanalyze everything in a really, really deep level. So that's his kind of job.
Right. All right, let me see what this one is about. So I copied, this is a transcription, a copy pasted transcription. So it's probably not going to be great, but I'll find you the relevant. Okay, let's take this passage as an example. He's saying, so he makes an argument here that there's a sense in which men always function by principles. Obviously, there's a sense in which they don't need to, because you can be someone who's like, but I don't care about principles. And so that there's two senses of this. But so he's saying that you can't help but be guided by some kind of generalization.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is you're a conceptual being.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you, like, what would you say to someone who's like, yeah, well, that's true. I'm definitely to some extent guided by generalizations, but I'm also guided by instinct and feeling. Like, because even introspectively, if you look at yourself, there's a sense in which that is true. And it's not easy to, I gave you the examples of like, okay, well, if you get on a bus or you get dressed, like you can assume, it makes sense to assume, okay, at one point I had to learn that consciously, but someone could still say, well, how do you know that if you use the word concept, how do you know you didn't just kind of like absorb it and it's not a generalization, it's just an automatic thing? Like, how do you know? If you can't remember, it's hard to, how do you validate this, if you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm thinking how to answer that. I mean, that is a good question. I think that's important to understand. Let me see. So, I mean, we're responding to that feeling that it almost feels like as if you've always known it to be true. Like, in a sense that you're like, the concept you have, it feels like it's always been there. It's like, how could it not have been there? It's like, so it's a matter of, I think, partially observing others. You can't just plainly introspect, because well, it's hard to know if concepts come from somewhere. So it really just has to start with, I guess, starting to reason out from, well, what is a concept in the first place? Like, if we really want to answer that in a deep philosophical way, that's how I begin, like analyzing what a concept is. But if you mean something that somebody can grasp on, that's meaningful, that they can start thinking from, I could say that it's a matter of understanding what we can shape about us. And I'm not going to get into all the details of how I know that every concept is volitional, but at least there are concepts that are, and that we can recognize that there are times we've learned principles and adopted them. We could, of course, argue whether all principles are, but we do know that there's some shaping of our lives that we recognize we do shape what kind of principles we've learned. Like, we can recall principles that we've learned, and would try to being able to see, can I extend that to other principles? I think that's the best I could do without an essay, because that's a deep question, because there's a lot to say about that.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just thinking.
Part of it is understanding what is the nature of man, because then we could understand what is going on in his head if we could understand by nature what he is. Because you can't just answer always like just deduce like, oh, these are facts and therefore this must be true. We got to observe people, we have to look at people and observe them as in a totality and work from there, not just assert that we're going to argue this to be true. Well, let's look at some things that people do, people say, people behave that might indicate this, which I would usually point to, like, say, like people like Einstein or people that we think of who weren't just born knowing things, but they've developed theories. Those are the sort of things we might want to think about, those sort of people
Right.
we observe and see, not just like, oh, I want to prove that concepts are all learned. Well, let's look at people. What concepts do
Right.
they have? What do we refer to as concepts? Where do they come from?
What about if someone said, well, okay, you're saying that we need to be guided by some kind of generalization, but aren't these just associations? And if you want to call them generalizations, like for example, we'll just keep it simple. There's a person and he uses his fork. He wants to eat. So he grabs a fork and he grabs any fork and he grabs the fork because he knows he can eat with a fork. It's association. It's just eat, use fork. And if you call that a generalization, then if you call that a generalization, then you could say that a lion generalizes when he eats a zebra because it's like zebra eat. So if you're saying eating with a fork is a generalization, then
I
eating
wouldn't.
eating a lion eating a zebra is a generalization. So therefore, lions can't avoid generalizations. Like where am I going wrong there? Because that's how I'm seeing it. Like if I'm going wrong, what?
I think part of it there is, well, one, we recognize that in the first place, lions don't have that conceptual capacity. So it would seem like
Yes.
there's something different, at least with what's in their head. And that should be enough to say, at least, I mean, they don't have principles like we think, they don't have the same type of generalization. I mean, the nature of what they can even hold in their head is dependent on what kind of entity they are.
Yeah.
I mean, we could always recognize that there's a different level of functionality between a lion and a human, even just on the level of language. Even if you can't demonstrate anything else, you could always at least point to language. And there's something there that you could recognize as, well, they're still operating on some other level, even their full capacity. It's hard to even avoid using a lot of it, at least. I mean, it's hard to, if it seems so naturally part of human nature, the nature of man, then it would be hard to avoid because of how natural it is to our functioning and existence.
Right. Okay. So there's a difference, obviously, between in terms of the way the mind operates between a lion and a man. But then can I say, oh, well, a man, that's true, I agree, but a man can also operate in terms of associations, like just like a lion can. So he works on, if we want
Right.
to make that distinction between there's a conceptual and non-conceptual, well, a man can to some extent operate like non-conceptually based on associations. Is that going, does that go wrong somewhere if someone says that?
Trying to see what's wrong. But I want to say it's wrong, but trying to give a good reason why it's wrong. Um, I mean, clearly we have the capacity for both, for associations as well as conceptual thinking. Um, still operating on something. I wonder if Ren distinguished between an implicit principle. I wonder if she might mean that, because that would make sense. You say the implicit principle, like a lion could say implicitly operates on a principle, even though it doesn't actually. Like if it were conceptual, you would say as something like a principle, but it's not,
Right.
so it's implicit.
Right.
Um, but it seems like she's not, or Peikoff isn't even getting at that. Like he's trying to say that there is still some kind of vague conceptualization.
Yeah, he's saying that he needs to be guided by some kind of generalization. So at least some kind of, nothing else will prompt a conceptual being to act. That's what got me, is like, okay, you can only be driven by a conceptual generalization. That's, to me, is like, that's what I'm trying to validate. Is that true? Like, I've definitely, that's why I asked a while ago about like, oh, well, how do I know that if I don't know, like some things I can see their actions prompted by previous conceptual generalizations, but then there are some things like, okay, if you scratch your leg, is that an action prompted by a previous is that an action prompted by a previous kind of generalization? Because so I'm just trying to draw that distinction between what is it that, how do I prove that there are definitely some major things that drive us and we have to act on, and they're all driven by conceptual generalizations, and what it isn't. Like heart beating obviously isn't, but it's not, it's pretty foggy to me. Like, yeah.
My intuition is to say that it's so natural to operate in a conceptual manner, that it's so part of the nature of man, that avoiding it is like, would literally just be non-functioning. You're just literally dead. Like you're not even, you're brain dead, literally, like laying there waiting to die, just rotting.
Right.
To me, that's like what it would be.
Right.
If you're really, truly not operating. But then on the other hand, then also is like an appeal to nature, just because it's natural, therefore it happens. Like because it's natural, it's inevitable, which I don't think is quite correct either. It'd be like the naturalistic fallacy that because it's natural, therefore we're always doing it, or because it's natural, therefore it's morally correct. It seems similar reasoning, but it wouldn't be valid. I mean, I want to say, what compels you to still act towards that? And I guess it's natural. It's so part of, perhaps.
I guess. Okay, so we can, I guess you can interpret it this way too. You can interpret it as he's not making the claim that all actions are prompted by generalizations, but it's enough that some are, right?
Yes.
And if some actions have to be driven by at least some, like you can't escape that some of your actions. So it's easy to validate this. If at least some of your actions have to be driven by generalizations, that's the kind of gotcha of not thinking in terms of principles, because he's saying that there's a mechanism by which you're doing damage to yourself and it has to happen, but he's relying on the fact that some of your actions are it's enough. If he's just relying on the fact that some of your actions are driven by conceptual generalization, then that's almost that's easier to go with, right? Like there's a difference between saying that and all of your actions are prompting, all of your actions are prompted by conceptual generalizations.
I think all actions would be going too far, but clearly some do operate that way. Or even at the very least, you couldn't operate by our full nature without those some using generalizations. You can't get rid of it entirely. You should use them whenever possible, because that's the fullest expression of your nature, is to generalize where possible. And if you don't where possible, then you're missing something. You're not functioning to your maximum. You're not even surviving to your maximum capacity, or your intellectually, so to speak, as we mentioned, the fullest extent of being.
Yes. Okay. I think I just sort of, I'm getting clear on where I'm having trouble here. Where I'm having trouble is that I can see clearly that there are some things I learn through thought, like they're much more abstract and conceptual. And so, an example might be, a recent example might be a concept called validation through business. Validation applied to life might be, it's a method or a way of thinking about decisions. Let's say you want to start a business and you want to try something. It's how do I test this as quickly and cheaply as possible? Or like you've got an idea for a podcast, or you've got an idea for some kind of course, and you're like, how do I, instead of putting in all this work right at the start and then finding out no one's really interested, how do I test that this idea is profitable and people will be interested? Assuming that's it, that's something that you want to find out. And so that I had to go through a process of thinking about, all right, how do you apply validation to different aspects of your life? Okay, to finding a job, how do you find a job without investing too much of your, like doing 3 years worth of courses? How do you test if you like it before you invest that much? It's anyway, to think about that whole thing was definitely a conceptual process, is my point. And so that's very clear. Like, okay, some things, yes, they're conceptual, they require generalizations and so on. But then there are other things that are just not, like, okay, your mom teaching you how to use a fork when you're a kid. Like, is that conceptual? Because I don't know, to me, that does seem a little bit similar to, like, I know a lion teaching its cub to hunt. Like, it's different in that the fork isn't given to us by nature, but there's a sense in which I have trouble thinking of that as conceptual.
Yes, spoons are an interesting case, even in psychology research. Spoons are very interesting. How kids learn to use spoons. To some extent, it could seem conceptual because it takes some further understanding of the purpose of tools, not just poking a stick in a log to get some ants. And that's one level of doing a tool, but they have to understand even intention with the tool, like which way it must face, how to balance the weight, which way it's intended to, what food is intended for, things like that. It's something much more complex.
I agree.
And that is not just a natural process. It takes some focus or conceptual reasoning that most animals cannot do.
Right.
Like monkeys have hard time with spoons. They never really learn how to hold it.
Right. I guess we could even avoid that rabbit hole by saying, okay, so we're driven by some generalizations. And then you've just got to identify that somehow you've got to concretize in a convincing way that a lot of the major important decisions and things you do are driven by conceptual generalizations. And then once you've done that, then you can say, then you can go into, okay, well, what happens if you don't think in principles and you disregard them, not either because you don't want to think about them or you haven't learned about them, like what's the result then? But it's enough if you can, I guess I can show convincingly that important aspects of your life are driven by these generalizations, which it's bizarre to, I when I try and think of like a convincing argument with lots of examples, nothing immediately comes to mind, but I might have to write about it.
So this party is talking about even associations, just as you were talking about, because going to this non-focused level, it would be animal like is automatized material, which would be just associations,
Right.
at best. That's almost automatic. I wouldn't quite call it automatic, but still the point is you're like, it's not like you're in control of making those connections like you are with concepts. It's not like you're like, it's something else entirely.
Right.
So it could be something the subconscious does. And I would almost guess that's the nature of the subconscious in relation to the conscious conceptual mind that makes it so humans will necessarily form some kind of principle. It's hard to say why, other than it is the case, but you could come up with a theory that the nature of the subconscious works makes it so that whatever thinking you've created conceptually will always be there, at least for some things, that it would be unavoidable just because of the way concepts are accessed. It's just the nature of the way it works. But we can observe that whatever the case might be, people that seem like they're not paying attention or whatever we might refer to. I mean, they are operating on a more automatic associative level, but it's a matter of, can we come up with an example of that? What
Yeah,
kind of person are we
right.
thinking of?
Yes, exactly. That's where I needed lots of examples because it's when it's like this, it's yeah, it's very difficult to, you know, I maybe I can regurgitate it if I read it, but I don't get it in the same way that I would if I had lots of examples. So yeah.
It would be about the nature of conceptual consciousness, something that's that fact makes these, even the automatic or the very basic perceptual associations, something that makes those even conceptual to some degree by nature of us being conceptual.
Right.
But if you
Yeah,
don't have a
okay.
conceptual capacity, it's just something else. I mean, that would go into science, but as far as philosophy, we only need to look at the examples, the concretes in reality. What do they do? How do they operate? I mean, obviously, the easy example is a drug addict, but that's more the obvious, clear example, or an alcoholic.
What,
But we have to think of,
how so? Can you in what
well,
sense?
well, if you think of the stereotypical, say, heroin addict that needs his fix every
Yep.
day, it's only really trying to operate on the level of, or they can only operate on the level of like perceptual associations or basic associations, that they don't have the capacity or even the focus to think longer term, to really focus their mind and attention in those ways.
Right.
I'm trying to think. In a way, if you hear what they say about their experience, they feel as if they don't have any control. They feel like they have no free will. It's not literally true, but they feel as if they lack it, that they can't. Even their desire to do something else is insufficient. So even that's like they're operating on just drives to needs to satisfy their cravings. I mean, that would seem like one example. Um, but trying to think other examples where
But how does
somebody's
that,
not.
and how is
Go ahead.
that, can you just explain the relationship of that to, I think, so the whole little section here was about, there's a sense in which you can't escape principles.
Yeah.
And so the drug addict is not escaping what principle?
Can I put like focus or maybe productivity? I'm trying to think of what would correspond to your ability to just like pay attention. Maybe just rationality, because rationality
Okay.
implies some sort of clarity of mind to be able to
Okay.
think. I would say it's about that they can't have that clarity. That because they don't have that clarity, it's more like the clarity of whatever, I don't know, a lion might have. Like they have some kind of clarity, like they know how to hunt, but clearly it's not the clarity of like what's the meaning of life. There's no clarity like that, obviously. So they're clear. This man would have to be functioning on a pretty low level.
Does it make sense to say that if someone, like the only person who this is relevant to, this whole section, is someone who is alive, obviously. And if someone is alive, then they had to have, like, there's a certain amount of generalizations, conceptual generalizations that they'd need to function. And so
Yep.
we're at least relying on that, right? Like if they didn't generalize anything, then they wouldn't, I don't know how they'd function and be alive. So even if someone who's not principled, there's a sense in which if they're alive now and they didn't just jump off a building or something, if they're alive, there's a sense in which they do have generalizations and they would have had to generalize in the past. And so they're relying on that.
I think that's part of it too. But I think he's also trying to say that even if you're not trying to operate by them, they've at least been automatized. they've been placed there. They've been built up. It seems like that's what he's suggesting.
Yeah, but that's what I don't, because that doesn't fit with what he says about,
Yeah,
you know, the whole process of forming generalizations is conscious, because there's, you know, there's I'm not sure if this is a contradiction, but I've heard multiple things that seem contradictory. Like on the one hand, the subconscious is purely passive and association based. And then on the other, there's always this argument here that comes up of like, you know, the automatized material gets, your principles get fed to you by the subconscious, which I still and did. I started interpreting as it just means excuse me, it just means you form associations and habits, not generalizations. But the person this applies to has already formed generalizations. So if they're then piling on, you know, like associations by habit, that's where the issue is. So I don't know. Does that make sense to you? What I'm saying?
I
Like,
think
there's a sense
so.
in which it's not that this is how I'm interpreting it now. The subconscious is not forming concepts. It's not forming generalizations. It's just creating associations and habits. And then the person to which this applies has had to at some point think and form generalizations on his own conceptually. Otherwise, he couldn't do anything. And to the extent that he then stops doing that, they'll just be, his subconscious is just going to throw associations, automated associations and habits at him, something like that. And yeah, I think that you know, clearly I'm not, I don't find this that self-evident or obvious. I think that's the main thing.
Yeah, let's keep going down. Let me
Yeah, okay.
clarify some of what his words are.
Yeah, I mean, he's saying that, you know, you have to basically, the ultimate choice for human behavior is reason versus emotion. And
Yes.
so if you, depending on how you conduct yourself in different situations, all you need is to drop the principle once before you're then acting on the other principle. So you drop reason once, and then now you're an emotionalist for that time.
At least for that time, yeah.
Yeah. And he's saying it becomes more and more dominant,
Right. Yeah, that's
which
what you
I'm going to
asked
write about
before.
as well. Yeah, I'm going to
Kind of
write about
like,
that too. Yeah.
how do you know, why should we believe the habituation is this thing? Why
Yes.
should we believe that it gets stronger?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why doesn't it just stop there? Like, gets a little
Right.
stronger and that's it.
Yep. I'm going to have to ask about that.
Yeah.
I think you could be easily tricked into thinking you understand this, but it's quite easy for someone to ask a lot of questions and then you're like, actually, I don't get it. Yeah. So here he says, look, this is why he justifies,
Yeah.
you know, why it gets bigger and bigger. It's because you can't be, it's because you're a conceptual being and you can't avoid integration.
Yes.
And so
I think, I don't know how much Peacock would agree with this, but I do say to some extent that once you've begun consciously integrating, your subconscious will always integrate further. That you're responsible for starting it, but your subconscious, once it's operating, will help you integrate. And I think that's just the nature of being a conceptual being, that whatever conceptual process you begin, even
right.
at a very basic level, I don't think you could even practically avoid starting it because it's so part of human functioning that anytime you think of thoughts, it starts to get integrated or takes some impact on your subconscious makes use
Okay.
of it to do something. And I'm not sure if that's what he's getting at, but that's how I'm understanding this, that there's always some process going on just by our nature.
Right.
That's how our
Okay.
I think a lot of it stems from the idea that being conceptual beings is part of our nature, and that's an unescapable fact. That's not just a choice that we had to be conceptual, but that we are by nature. There's something about it that is essential to our functioning as individuals, as animals, is what we are. You can't totally avoid it because it's part of the way we operate, and it serves a function in our biology. So it's just natural to do it. Yeah.
The way I've thought about what you've said is that, okay, we're conceptual beings, and so our subconscious also has a certain nature, which might be something like, if I act, for example, if I tell a white lie in one situation, then the next time I feel a similar emotion, my subconscious will present me with the material from that past situation. So that's association, but it's like it puts things on the, almost like the equivalent of on the tip of the tongue in terms of a concept. So like you do things, you take actions, your subconscious will kind of, however you want to describe the mechanism, association, I don't know, but it'll give you in certain moments feelings and associations that put concepts on the tip of your tongue. Maybe that's what you mean.
I'm that's sure. Sort of my take on that.
Okay,
it seems like this sentence here, he's saying something similar, maybe, that can avoid some form of thought that is integration, because they need some kind of guidance with what to do. Maybe in the same way that it doesn't matter if you like listening to things, like you're going to hear whether you want to or not. You're probably going to respond to things that you hear. It's a capacity that's natural to what you are and your nature. You can't really not do it. But in some sense, you could ignore it maybe, but.
So how does this fit in with evasion then? If you can't avoid integration, does that mean you can't actually fully evade? Well, if you can't avoid integration, let me just think of how I want to word this. If you can't avoid integration, then that means to some extent integration is not volitional.
I mean, I guess you could say to some extent, but I mean, it doesn't change it from being volitional, because you must initiate and finish it. I mean, it's not like every second it's not like you're putting a box in your brain and fitting in your neurons. And I mean, to some extent, your neurons do what they do, but it's still that you're in charge. I mean, clearly you don't decide when the neurons fire, literally speaking, but that is kind of what's going on.
Do you think maybe when he's saying you can't avoid integration, he means you can't avoid integration if you want to survive, something like that?
No, I think he's just flat out saying you can't avoid doing some extent.
Okay.
Yeah, it says the essence of a conceptual consciousness is integration. And I think he's saying that for that reason. Or to say that, I'd say the essence of a conceptual consciousness is that even an unthinking person cannot avoid it in some form, even if it's primitive or bad or basic. I mean, we could say it's bad because it's not the fullest extent that it could be. I mean, there's that.
Okay.
And he's saying that the irrational subconscious principle, how could that be? I mean, to me, I still don't like the idea that principles could be subconscious.
Yeah, I don't either, because I don't get it.
Yeah, that's almost one of the lines that, like, I'd almost question if Rand did agree.
Yeah.
I don't know, because that's one of the things I'm really seeking, like feeling something off about that.
Yeah, I mean, he goes into why does it work this way if you default consciously, evil or what's bad wins subconsciously? And isn't it the case that if you do, and it isn't the case if you do nothing, good pops up? I think this goes to Aristotle's point of like, the good is defined by one specific way or method, whereas everything else is bad, right? Like everything outside, it's goes back to that. You set the context with a standard, so that standard might be the end, and then there are only specific things you do to get that end, and everything else is bad. And so I think that's the point he's making here. But
You easily escape. Can escape some.
yeah, I mean, it goes back to like some integration. So it's basically there's a sense what, yeah, I'm trying to get at that because I'm being, on the one hand, I'm reading, okay, integration is a conscious volitional process. On the other, like, apparently it's not, because if you default, your brain will integrate mindlessly.
Yeah.
Um,
I'd say just there has to be some integration, and integration in this sense.
yeah.
Integration, yes. There's always some integration. It's just, yeah.
I think basically a lot of this is just maybe emotionalism versus reason, and that's it. But this is yeah, I'm not clear. Like, look, to some extent, I understand this, but there's a large degree to which I'm a little confused by it, and I'm not actually that convinced either. Like, this is not convincing enough for me to say, oh, okay, that one instance where I acted impulsively is bad for me. It's
Scroll
not.
up a little bit.
Okay.
Just want to look at this one more time. It almost sounds like he's saying the need to integrate something is so strong within the human context, the human life, that to even function at all as a living thing, you will integrate to some extent.
Right.
It's just a necessary thing.
Right.
That it is just part of literally being alive, having a life.
Right.
That if you didn't do it, you would. That's like he's almost saying that it's almost unheard of to not do it at all. Like,
right.
I think if somebody stopped doing that entirely, they're just in a catatonic state. I mean, that's really the only time I can think of when somebody's not even thinking at all, like literally blank. Like they can't even move. They can't talk. Repetitive movements, they can't do anything. That's the only example I could think of when somebody's literally not even thinking. Like they're like blank, but they're not dead, clearly. And that's the only thing I can think of. Like they're not even functioning. So on some level, it's like almost you have to accept that functioning with integration, at least on a basic level, is like a basic biological function in a way. In the same way that even shallow breathing is still breathing. It's terrible, but at least you're alive. It's like shallow thinking is bad, but at least it's just a bad way to be, a bad biological state, bad psychological state.
Okay.
It's non-functional to your life. It's not what makes up the rational life or the nature of man's life.
Okay, I'm gonna have to write about that one too. I'd like to, because it's linked to this. We don't need to go over this because it's the same point. It's that you undercut, if you act on a bad principle, you remove grounds for you to oppose the principle next time, and thereby it spreads. But I think what I need for all of these is just examples, because they're too.
Yes.
It's very. Yeah.
But really focus on man as a living organism. I think it's easy to get stuck in the abstraction and forget that this is just a biological function in a way. That's just part of what we are. We are conceptual. Right. It's like your vision. It's just part of what you are. And it's just
right.
And to some extent almost unavoidable sometimes.
Right. Okay. Let's see. Oh, maybe I go to the government. covered some of this. I'm just finding. Okay, I want to ask you something here, actually. So about individual rights as absolute. So there's a sense in which you can say no country absolutely respects rights, not by this definition of rights.
Mhm.
And every country is collectivist. If you, to different degrees, there are definitely degrees, but in a sense, every country is collectivist. And there's this African proverb here that I found. A child is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. So it's like take care of every child. Is collectivism an application of the ethics of altruism, or is it the case that collectivism, if I just look at this quote, then I don't know if Africans had philosophers who taught altruism. That's just the kind of natural state that we end up in being. I actually don't know. Let me just think about what I wanted to say here. Yeah, okay. I guess there's two things. So one is there's a sense in which every country is collectivist, even the more freer countries, to a degree less than, say, or a significant degree less than, for example, Iran or whatever. But it's still collectivist, and they still don't respect rights in the sense defined here. Does that mean that someone could then reason, well, if my rights aren't being respected, I don't need to respect the laws of this country, or the laws I don't agree with? Like, does that make sense? For example, they might go, all right, well, I'm not going to pay when I get on buses. I'm just going to get on buses, or I'm going to do this and that. I'm not going to pay because they don't respect my rights. Is there room for that kind of argument to be made?
Yes, but it depends what that line is. When do you cross that line where you stop obeying? Like, when does it become revolution? When is it rational to revolt
Yeah,
rather than just obey?
I don't
And
know.
I don't know the answer to that.
Well, it's tricky because, we say that principles apply within a context. For example, honesty applies when no one is trying to kill you. That's as best as I can describe it. If someone comes to your door and they're like, tell me where the baby is, that's the example given. Like,
Yes.
the application of context, the application of honesty within that context is not to tell them. But then if you're in a country where your rights aren't fully respected, how does trade, let's say the principle of trade, apply when you use public transport? Like, technically you don't have, like, it's nothing's going to tell you should you pay this time or not. Like, it's anyway, I don't know, but there is, so you do think there is room to think about that, but it's not clear how that even, I don't even know how that works in that context. Like, for some reason with honesty, in that specific example, it seems simple. Oh, okay, someone wants to murder you, don't tell them the truth. But then
Yeah.
in the example of, like, okay, you're in a country that doesn't respect your rights, and you're like, well, how can I disobey as many laws as possible without being caught or whatever? Then there's no obvious application of the principle.
I don't think so. Because there's so many interlocking parts.
Right.
That's why it's so difficult.
Okay.
And I'm not even sure
It
when you
does seem like
decide.
you'd almost have to go by feeling too, as well.
Yeah, because there's so many things to consider that you can't overwhelm yourself every decision of what might go wrong.
Right.
In the same way, like, what if an asteroid hits you? In the same way, like, you're trying to reason out every single ethical consequence of every action. You'll be overwhelmed, and that would ruin your life too.
Okay. I guess we're not gonna. Yeah, that's a difficult, and it's probably not that important a point to make. But then, what do you think about, like, so this claim that collectivism politically as an application of altruism? Given whatever history you study, do you think it's the case, or do you think collectivism, one application of one instance, some instances of collectivism are applications of altruism?
Just from what I know, it seems very common
Okay.
that it would make sense to easily observe that anybody that says like the family above the individual, the collective above the individual, or state above the individual is always, I don't think there's ever anything other than say like you owe it to society or something like that. That's like an obligation to society. I mean, maybe the Romans were a bit different, and the ancient Greeks maybe, but not since the modern era. At least not since the collapse of Rome. I think everything's been that way.
In terms of collectivism, you mean?
Yeah, the Romans you could argue about that, I think, and the Greeks you could argue about it, but after the Romans, everything seems either any instance of well, it seems most governments are quite collectivist, and it's always most usually dependent on the
Religion?
altruism, like owing it. Probably religion is a big part of it, but I think even in China, like filial, and Confucianism was a big impact on that, to being like family above all. And in Europe, that would be religion, Christianity. And I
Right.
think that's a big reason that altruism leads to collectivism. I'm not sure about like before Confucius and before Christianity,
Right.
but
Okay.
since then, definitely.
Right.